So for that, you clearly need to have a very clear understanding of what user wants. And that's why you need user data, behavioral data, and more importantly, you need to really go beyond that data as a customer obsessed product manager. I would highly recommend to do this, which is to go not just have your analytics data, but really understand the motivations and emotions of your users that actually justifies those behavior that you're having. Ideally, what I also like to do is once you deliver personalization, what is the end state of that motivation or emotion would be? So if you deliver the best personalization system, you have best possible ML engineers, best AI algorithm, and if you deliver it, how would they feel? And how would that reflect in their behavior? And you need to have that some idea around it. And that can be represented in the qualitative format through the NPS scores or through the customer feedback, or also in the quantitative format through leading and lagging KPIs that we talked about.
Welcome to the Product Development Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Wakeling. In this episode, I'm joined by Varun Ghatge, who is a head of product at the BBC, focusing on the cross-product personalization and recommendation for all BBC brands. In this episode, we'll be uncovering what a great personalized product experience looks like, as well as an introduction into recommendation engines and models. So, Varun, it's great to have you here. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited for this.
Excellent. Well, I gave you a very brief introduction there, so maybe guide the listeners and viewers through a bit of your journey in product to where you are today.
Sure. I'm sort of a technical background product manager. I started my career as a C++ developer, then I moved on to mobile development. I'm doing product management for the last 15 years. I worked in the companies like Paddy Power, Tesco's, Barclays, and now BBC. So quintessentially British brands. And I had a really good fortune to work in Barclays and in BBC to work on the AI products. So, and this was back in 2016 when Google just announced that they are moving to be AI first company. So it was on the cusp of that AI becoming and ML in technology becoming more widespread. So that got me into the early doors of AI product management, understood some really good nuances around it, and was fortunate to apply here in BBC as well. Some of those, especially impact of ML technologies on user experience and organization in general. So really excited to talk about it in more details as we go along in this podcast.
Great stuff. Well, I think it'd be good to start with a few definitions, because in my head, I'm not quite sure how recommendation fits into personalization. Is it a subset of personalization as a theme, or is it very much a different thing? So maybe you can explain how you see those definitions.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think how I would say this is like recommendation is very much a subset of personalization. And it's one way to do it. I think if I just zoom out, like what is personalization? Let's just talk about that essentially first. So personalization essentially is you have something, in a sense, you are selling a product, you are selling a service, or you are selling an experience, and user have some needs to whom you're selling has some needs and some preferences and some choices. So when you try to meet what you have with what people want at a scale, you have personalization. So if you make that of a broader definition of personalization, you get a recommendation as a part of it. But there are so many other ways. Like the simplest example I can give you is that if you go on Amazon, if you browse few things at the bottom, it just shows your history that is browsed. That has nothing to do with your recommendation, but it's still your history. It's what you did with that platform. It's a really good example of personalization. There are so many others we can give you. Like if you go on Netflix, they talk about continue watching, what you watch, what you left in between. Another example of personalization without recommendation. So recommendation is very much a subset of personalization.
What from a product perspective, the essential components of a recommendation engine or model, how does it break down?
So recommendation essentially has a very much a implicit nature to it by definition, because you're recommending something to user based on what you know about them. And that means you have taken some sort of preferences from them, what do they like, and then you're recommending, rewarding them for giving those preferences to you. That's one form to look at recommendation. Another form is you probably don't ask user what they want, but you just observe what they're doing, how their behavior is on your system, and then you use smart techniques of what you currently have. You know that in much more detail, and you try to match it to what how users are behaving on your sites and what they're liking and what they're disliking, and you're matching it to that. So that's very broad definition of recommendation. One of the key thing I've learned in my experience about recommendation, especially we sort of diverted between ML and recommendation. So I wanted to sort of make that very much clear that um, big mistake some organization make is they start with the problem in mind that I want to do recommendation or I want to do personalization rather than trying to understand what problem they are trying to solve. So if someone in top end organization telling you we need to do recommendation, then it's probably going to not work out well because you don't know the problem that you're trying to solve. So some of the basic stuffs of product management, some of the basic frameworks of product management very broadly apply and very strongly apply to the personalization, which is what are you trying to do? Why are you trying to solve the problem? Why personalization matter in our context, and how recommendation and all those fit into that are really important things to consider. I can give a really interesting example of it in my experience when I was working at one of the e-com company. So one of the challenge was management as a whole has decided that we wanted to increase the profit margins and we wanted to increase profit as a general for organization. And idea was if we surface the audience, the hypothesis being that if we surface the audience, the products that they like, more products that they like, the more bigger the basket size and bigger the profits, which sounds fair, right, on the surface. So we built a strong recommendation algorithms and say that like here you go, like the most relevant products that you can get. And what we saw that we actually saw increased click-through rate, increased basket size, we increased basket size in terms of pound value by almost 12%. But that didn't resulted in increase in the profits, primarily because how our recommendation algorithm worked. They surfaced what audience like, and what audience like was a low profit, low cost products. So we ended up surfacing more low cost products to the audience. So we did not meet our goal of profitability, even though we increased this revenue, top line revenue, but that was not the objective. So these are the subtle things that actually try to sort of, when you start with a recommendation as a solution, you try to end up in these scenarios where you're not matching the problem that you are trying to solve with the solution. So that's why it's really important to have a very clear understanding of what is the problem you're trying to solve and how recommendation actually fits into that, or personalization actually fits into that.
Yeah, it's fascinating how it can actually have a negative impact on the metrics, as you said there. How can you try and avoid that, or is it just the unknown of implementing something like this?
I think it's this is where it's really important to have very clear idea of the KPIs that you're going to track, and how, and especially like profit and even the click-through rates sometimes are very much lagging indicators. So you need to have a very clear mapping of metrics, like what are my key indicators, like input metric, and what are my output metrics. And if you improve the recommendation, you need to sort of run some scenarios where, irrespective of the algorithm of recommendation that you're using, right? You might be having the best recommendation algorithm or even the average recommendation algorithm. You can run these scenarios through existing data that you have, like what kind of product are likely to be recommended, what kind of metrics are likely to move. So it really goes into the form of two things. Like from a product management perspective, you need to really have a good product sense. You need to have that business mind of a product manager, saying that what are the ways that this can get screwed up because you presented something that is not related to the objective that you have. And then coming back from that, what are the leading indicators that actually makes me feel that? So in this particular case that I gave you, the leading indicator could have been if all the baskets are filled to the maximum level that we can fill it for the average consumer level, we should have calculated the bucket size, average bucket size on the recommendation from the previous data, what would be the profit margins of that, and does it meet the profit margin goal? But simple, where we actually break down in this particular process was we actually thought bigger basket size was actually leading to the better profit margins. But that was not the case. So that's why it is really important to go very clear hierarchy of metrics and where does it relate back to what you want to do.
Not to go on too much of a tangent early on, but you mentioned product sense there. How do you improve your product sense? Is it something which is just you can't really learn it; it just happens through experience? Or what's your take on that?
No, I think it's a very much a skill, and like any other skill, it needs repetition. You need to train your brain constantly for it, and no matter how you feel as an individual, whether you feel like you got the product sense or you feel like very uncomfortable about it, only real thing is that you need to keep on practicing. And even if you feel like right now that you're at the top of your game, and you stop practicing, you're going to lose it. So it's a skill that you need to keep on hammering on. And there are so many good articles. Like the recent one I've been reading was like this newsletter where he actually talks about having constant talk about your business metric and having deeper understanding of it. Then working with a very strong product managers in your team or in your structure at that bit like then that product manager could be sideways, top, bottom, or like someone below you or someone above you as well. But just being around people who actually have a really good product sense and talking product to them is a really good way to learn product sense, in my opinion. And then the practice that I personally like to do is that when some big product announcements happens with any big tech company or any other company, I like to run this thought experiment of what are the metrics they are trying to move, what made them to that decision, what is the next step for them would look like. So that mental exercising constantly keeps me on top of my game. Like, how can I extrapolate this? How can I make it this 10x better? Kind of question. If you keep on asking yourself, that also helps a lot. So those are few techniques like reading yourself, being surrounded by people who are obsessed with the product sense or are good at product sense, and then doing constant thought experiments does help a lot. And the last tip around that one is that have a good sense of technology. I think that maybe from me, who's coming from tech background, to constantly understand how evolving technology is going to affect the user experience is surprisingly good technique to understand and develop the product sense.
Yeah, it's probably a bit of a challenge if you're in a smaller company that maybe you're the only product manager or maybe there's one other product person and you don't have as many people around you to learn from. I think surround yourself in a community of other product people, or even try and reach out to a mentor or a coach. I think that's probably also a good thing to do if you're struggling to find people in your immediate surroundings.
Yeah. I mean, you don't need to sort of like, even if you're in a startup company, right? My strong advice would be founders are really good, have a product sense. That's how they started company. That's how they have funding. So they usually tend to have really strong product sense. And also, one big thing behind product sense, right? You're trying to marry user needs with the business needs. So you need to be really good at one of those things naturally, or have a good sense, or have a good mentor on one side in form of your manager or in form of your founder or anything like that. And then you can bringing the other aspect of it continuously through the practice. But yeah, it's not impossible to find if you look for it, but you need to know what you find with what qualities to find with them.
What would you recommend in terms of product people to be able to better build personalized and recommendation features in their product?
So if you're talking about like what are the best practices for building better personalization, few points. Let's call it like 5 pointers. I've sort of mentally I always check for these when we're building a personalization. As I said, like the definition of personalization is you have something, either product or service or experience that you're trying to match to what user wants, and you're trying to do it at a scale. So that's when you actually are building a proper personalized system. So for that, you clearly need to have a very clear understanding of what user wants. And that's why you need user data, behavioral data, and more importantly, you need to really go beyond that data as a customer obsessed product manager. I would highly recommend to do this, which is to go not just have your analytics data, but really understand the motivations and emotions of your users that actually justifies those behavior that you're having. Ideally, what I also like to do is once you deliver personalization, what is the end state of that motivation or emotion would be? So if you deliver the best personalization system, you have best possible ML engineers, best AI algorithm, and if you deliver it, how would they feel? And how would that reflect in their behavior? And you need to have that some idea around it. And that can be represented in the qualitative format through the NPS scores or through the customer feedback, or also in the quantitative format through leading and lagging KPIs that we talked about. Apart from that, you also need to have contextual awareness of user, how they use your product in what context do they use product? Do they just use it on mobile? Even if you have the web version, do they just use it on TV, or do they just use it on some other mechanics? And usually, if you're in a sort of state where you're 0 to 1 personalization state, then what usually happens is that you don't have personalization, then users are finding some substitutes for it. What are the substitutes they are finding? How are they using those substitute? Actually really gives you really good insight into building better products and better personalization, because you can bring that context and serve it 10x better if you know what they're doing right now. Then comes the then bigger thing to think about is the data quality and infrastructure. Personalization doesn't exist without data, and when I say data, I also not just mean user data in this particular case. Knowing your inventory or knowing what you're selling in much more detail is really critical. What I tend to think is that like people start on and this has happened in my past experiences. People start with a very strong ambition. They actually spend a lot of time understanding users, but they don't know enough about what they're selling, especially if they are having enormous quantities of it. So if you are Spotify, you have huge amount of audio collection. You need to understand what's in that audio collection to its nth level. So, for example, Spotify actually record the music and convert it into wavelengths and track that wavelength as one of the input parameters and as a metadata of the music that they have. Netflix has developed a system where they actually automated the metadata tagging based on what's in the image of the videos and all those things. So really good tech organization has gone to the nth level to understand in detail the supply that they have so that they can really match it to what user really want. So it's really important to have that data knowledge of your system or what you're selling. And then you need to have a system which is infrastructure for the data so that you can actually get volume, variety, and recency of data. Like personalization is extremely transient. Like user needs are changing every single day. So if you think you're done, you're never done with personalization. So you need a system or infrastructure where you're continuously capturing the user data, you're storing it. It has a variety of it because if you just capture one type of users, then you are going to skew up your personalization. So you need to have volume, variety, and recency in your data. And the only thing I would say is that don't get overwhelmed by all this. Especially when you're starting, you're not going to have perfect data, and that's fine. There are so many other ways we can talk about it as we go along, but there are so many other ways you can substitute not having the data. And I can almost guarantee you, no matter what you are, if you're starting in a big organization or small organization, when you're starting personalization in particular product area for the first time, you're not going to have enough data. So you have to have that ability to do the A/B testing, the experiments to get that data. And that was going to be my next point, which is like with the transient nature of personalization and transient nature of data, you need to continuously experiment, because without that, you're never going to know what's really happening and what is changing. And also, building personalization system is extremely expensive, whether it's 0 to 1 or even maintaining is very expensive in certain cases. So experiment can reduce the cost. Experiment can point you in the right direction. So it's really important to continuously experiment, continuously test, and fill that gap of data through the experiment, and also get the validation of the problems that you're doing. And these days, I think the most important thing people forget about data is that data is not privileged. Data is a responsibility, especially user data. So you need to have very good practices around data. You need to ensure the privacy, the compliance, and just general trust that user puts on you when they give you your data to be used responsibly, ethically, and in the right way. It's not just about acting responsibility, but if you're really smart about it, you can convert into really good experience. So, like if you're giving a recommendation, if you tell users why they are seeing that recommendation, they feel more comfortable, and that's actually generally accepted as a good user experience. And I think another interesting thing, especially in algorithms, especially in ML, what happens is that it tends to have a bias because of uh, you train the ML model based on past data, and your past data can be skewed for multiple reasons. Like one example I have in my from my past again is we were running this experiment on the one of the e-com product that I was managing with recommendations, and suddenly without changing anything, our metrics started to move in a very right direction, and we are getting a lot of click-throughs and a lot of bigger basket size and all those things. And it's like, why is it happening? And then we realized that one of our competitors had actually stopped promoting. So now they're coming back, people are coming back to us. And we are thinking our ML model is doing really, really well. So that's why it's really important to have that awareness of what is going around you and make sure that it's not replicated in your system is really key. And this is where subtleties that product manager can bring in to the table that probably sometimes very hard for data scientists or machine learning engineer who's just focusing on building better models as they should. Last important tip, again from my experience on this one, is especially if you're starting again 0 to 1 personalization in your organization, is you need to have a better partner in your organization, because culturally when you do personalization, you are likely to disrupt some of the power dynamics in your organization, because that might be currently be done through the marketing team or through the design team or through the sales team. But someone else might be substituting the personalization in your organization, and when you're trying to build it suddenly at a scale and at a one-to-one level, someone is going to feel threatened, and that creates a problem for you to move forward. And if that person is director level or a senior person, then you're going to face even more problems. So try to create more alliances with your team members, understand the culture of your organization in certain cases, or else you are not likely to be successful in its truest form. So those are the few tips I had. Sorry, I've been talking for a long time.
That's amazing. There's so much to unpack there. So yeah, understanding the user, pretty fundamental in terms of products, generally data governance. I think you touched on a few things there. And then data quality is an offshoot from that as well. An experimental approach. So yeah, A/B testing, not only to lower risk, but also in terms of the cost involved. Contextual awareness as well, making sure that your infrastructure is flexible to accommodate future changes. And as you said, data changes, people's behaviors and needs change, and that needs to be flexible with that. Potential biasing of data, as you mentioned as well. Knowing the end state and wider market awareness, and then finally that creating alliances internally across teams. So yeah, as a product manager, there's lots to think there in terms of if you're wanting to dive into recommendation at a significant scale, a lot to factor for sure. Is there a kind of importance hierarchy there? Is there a number one, number two, or are they just all required thinking in terms of this sort of product development?
It depends upon which level you are at in your organization in terms of delivering personalization. But I think two things are unsubstitutable, or are the most important one, I would say, are understanding user needs and understanding the metadata of your products that or services that you are trying to sell. Without that, you really can't do personalization, frankly. So those two are the critical bits, I would say. In certain cases, like especially if you're starting from a very, very scratch, it's okay not to have complete infrastructure, because you can also do something like what I call one-to-many personalization rather than one-to-one personalization. So at a segment level personalization, if you don't have proper infrastructure for it, and all those things. So you can live to start with without proper infrastructure and validate and then sort of build infrastructure slowly. But there is absolutely no substitute for not knowing knowing your users and not knowing what you have. So you have to have those things. These days, I think it's really, really, really critical to use the data responsibility. Whatever data you have to use it responsibility, or else no matter how good your personalization is, if people don't trust you, they won't use you.
Yeah, I think trust is very much a key word moving forward when it comes to anything AI. It's going to be a key differentiator in the market. If you can build trust with your users, it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So if, let's say you're a product manager and you work for a company who doesn't have a recommendation feature set in their product, and let's say that product is something like a news website which has advertising around, they're interested in driving lots of traffic, they're interested in getting them to view multiple pieces of content per session in order to get more value from them to advertisers, whatever. It's a pretty common story. What should a product manager be doing in terms of they've been tasked to explore the world of recommendation feature sets? How should the product manager think about that? Let's say they got some understanding of user problems, but where does it go from there?
I think the fundamental thing is, again, let's start with the goal, because I think the way you explained it, there are multiple goals there, right? Like, do you want to keep user for longer time? Do you want them to see more advertisement? Do you want them to click on more advertisement? Those are very different problem statements, frankly. So you need to really understand what is your goal. And especially news organization coming from BBC, I would highly recommend is that what are your organization ethos also plays a big role in that, because you don't want to create echo chambers or just deliver one kind of a news unless you are in a different kind of organization. But let's imagine that's embedded in your organization ethos, so you're quite aware of that. But fundamental thing is have a very clear understanding of goals, and what I call like a metrics tree. You need to build that. So if you want to think about, let's imagine in this particular case, your goal is to increase engagement, because then you're going to see more content. More content means, of course, more retention. Let's not go into the advertisement side of it. So what I would highly recommend is that, like, what are the basic input criteria for increasing the engagement time? So in this particular case, might be you need to say three or four, five different types of content when I'm done reading the news, so that I can jump on to the next one. So you need to know the content impressions as one of the input metric. But then you might want to think about things like, do I want to increase just by text-based news, or do I need to use a video-based news? Because that actually has a different implication. So what form of content that you can deliver in this particular case, you need to be aware of that as well. So first thing, so those are the few things I would probably start with. Make it very clear goal. Write down few of the metrics tree, like what is your output metric, what are the few input metrics that you're going to see, along with output metric, and then once you know the metric, once you know what is going to lead to that increase in engagement, then before even touching the ML system, I would highly recommend to build some smaller experiment with the help of simple tools. Like, for example, you can ask user for their interest while they're reading the news. Like, do you like this topic? And if they say yes, then you can surface more news about that particular topic without having to do massive scale, high level personalization. Or you can actually curate the content related to it and show it right next to it and see which users are clicking, and then you keep on refining it. And that way you actually know how users are behaving on your system. And at the same time, especially in early stage, I would highly recommend to go and speak to your users, because they will tell you why they did what they did. Even though you can't do it at a scale, you will still get a very strong indications of it. Including some survey pages or something like that, it will not be a bad idea either, so that you can get actually what users are doing and how they are feeling about it. And once you start getting that information, then you can start automating some bits of it. Like, if this is the type of news they're watching, bring all the content related to this topic, which is tagged like this. So that's why tagging and metadata is really important. So you need to bring that, and then you can start including more complicated concepts like collaborative filtering, then content metadata filtering, and then mix algorithms, and then you can keep on adding to it. And so yeah, so those are the few tips I have. I think one smart tip I can give you on this one is that don't try to set the benchmarks before you even have the system. So I've made those mistakes before, where you sort of, before even you build a recommendation experience, you sort of say that I want to get X amount of click-through rates, or I want to get X amount of time spent, before even I have built anything. So what usually helps through this experimentation is that you can start benchmarking and then start sending up the higher targets. Or else what you're likely to do is you're going to set very high or improbable target, and then you're going to say that it didn't work. So it's like killing the baby in its crib, because you don't have a system to deliver that level of experiences. So launch something, read something, and then set a benchmark to achieve next, and see if you can meet those benchmark, or else you're setting up yourself for a failure.
Yes, it's so much to unpack. I mean, as you said before, it's very much dependent on your goals, and I assume early on, in terms of some validation in some of your hypotheses, you can approach it in quite a manual way. I mean, you mentioned about speaking to people, so could you even do, Wizard of Oz kind of style testing, where you have someone in the background kind of in real time adjusting stuff in their experience, or what ways to kind of manually do those without having to actually integrate recommendation engines yet into your code base?
there is a very known problem with the recommendation systems is that, or even personalization system in general, that if you try to do it too much in a simulated environment, you're likely to get very skewed results because especially the lab testing might not be good. I think what would be really useful when I say talk to your users is that when you launch something and when people have used it, then get a real time feedback on that rather than try to do it in a lab-based environment, especially for personalization system, and especially if you have some level of personalization and if you're going into building MLs and all those things, it's very hard to get those results at a very small quality data size of that, like 3 or 4 people, for example. So best thing to do, in my opinion, is that launch the system, then keep on asking people some direct questions around it so that they can use the product in a real time environment and real content rather than fake content, because it's very hard to understand what's going on if you use the fake content.
Yeah. I think, once it's actually live, I guess you can obviously ask questions like, how accurate was this, or how good was this recommendation for you? And obviously that's all fed back into the database.
And also on that side, right, if you ask that type of question, that like, did people like it or not? I think that's also a very dangerous question. What you need to really understand is that, did it solve the problem that you have? Like, that's the kind of a question you need to have. Like, what was your motivation to come on website? Did we solve the problem for you? Did you find what we built for you useful? Rather than saying that, did you like the recommendation? Because they probably don't know what the recommendation this means. So that's why like you can use some of the user research experts in your team. But if you as a product managers are going, try to avoid the indicative questions or technical languages, or else you're not going to get good feedback.
So on the metadata side, any tips you can give people in terms of using the data that they have in the best way possible in terms of these sort of recommendation features?
It's very much industry specific. Like e-com has a different challenges. I think e-com has certain advantages as well. So because you have that product display experience, you actually have metadata available to you readily. It's stored in a certain way, so it's available in certain ways. But if you're in a content-based organization, it's not obvious, and there is literally endless way to tag your data. It's never done in that sense, because you can tag the same information literally zillions of ways. So collecting that metadata is an art, frankly, and this is where sort of ML maintenance sort of comes in. Like once you have that 0 to 1 system, then to get to the next level, you need to keep on feeding the data, and you need to keep on improving your hypothesis. You need to keep on introducing new parameters from user side and from your content metadata side to improve the quality of recommendations. Especially since users have changing need, they might start liking the different things. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to update your inventory. You might want to surface a different inventory that you have rather than surfacing the same inventory and that you used to surface to the audience. So the tip around that one is that keep adding more parameters, but with a very strong hypothesis in mind. Test those hypotheses, and if it's not, remove those parameters, because maintaining those metadata parameters can also be a very tedious task if we are not using it. So we have a hypothesis-based approach to tagging metadata and adding metadata. That's definitely one tip I'll give you.
So as you said, very different for different industries, e-commerce, content-based news, let's say, organization. And you did say earlier about the text and video as obviously very different things in terms of how to get metadata and what that data is. In terms of the maintenance then, you mentioned that a few times and the challenges surrounding it. What are the challenges of maintaining good metadata and maintaining the algorithms to making sure that you're delivering the right content to people?
Yeah, really interesting question. I think there are a few things, right? I think let's just start with 3 or 4 buckets. Let's start with the data. So data is really interesting challenge because, as I said, the data you need to have volume of it, you need to have variety of it, and you need to have recency of it, or else you're not able to deliver better quality personalization. But that means you need to have an infrastructure that captures the voluminous data, processes voluminous data. If you're using machine learning system, you need to have ability to clean that data. There will be a lot of noise in it. You need to label that data. You need to then retrain the models. Sometimes that can be really, really tricky. You need to have that entire MLOps system, which needs to be continuously maintained like a well-oiled machine, or else the quality of transaction will stop dropping. So you need so data infrastructure, data quality, and data stack for continuously maintaining the models is really, really key. I would say, and even if you're not using machine learning, you still need that data. So that's why ability to store and retrieve and process that data is continuously needed. Some of the interesting challenge with ML technology, especially again in the 0 to 1 organization, is that if you don't have ML models that are talking to your front end, ability to introduce that creates a whole level of problems on the front end side or on your tech stack, because now your UI is going to be dynamic. It's not just if else based. It's based on predictive modeling, and it changes for every single users. So you need to have that flexibility in UI, dynamism in your UI, and if you're doing it for the first time, that can be really daunting. And then you need to, every single time you upgrade the UI, you need to sort of make sure like how it's going to respond to the changing needs at a user level. So that makes it really interesting problem as well. So that's another aspect of maintenance that you need to be very clearly aware of. Metrics, I think metrics is really, really, KPIs and metrics tracking is really, really interesting problem. And there is a reason I'm sort of calling that out separately from data, predominantly because it's more result oriented, how you are measuring the result. And then there are so many challenges that you will face if you're not on top of your game, because what happens is that there are external factors, as I mentioned, like competition does certain things, or certain announcement happens outside. So if there is a big thing that happened on, especially the news organization, and suddenly people are consuming your news, is it because your algorithm is good, or is it something that news is really important? So having that ability to really understand and remove that noise, external noise, and keep the KPIs tracking, like what actually moved because of my algorithm and what actually got moved because of external noise, is really key. And that's where it can get really tricky to maintain that. And the last bit, I think, again, this goes back to the cultural challenge. The more sophisticated you get, more bigger the personalization becomes in your organization, more other parts of the business would try to use it. There would be unintended consequences when you suddenly change parameters. There would be requests coming from all angles to do for you to do things. So you need to have very clear objective of your North Star, so that you don't compromise on the integrity of your personalization quality.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to get carried away, isn't it, as well? Because it's a fun thing to explore and get excited about, but then you need to rein it in at the same time. Otherwise, unintended consequences.
Exactly. An interesting aspect also around this one is the legal changes, because what happens is that, like, if your privacy changes are continuously getting updated, you need to continuously respond to that immediately. And this has been a real case where suddenly users stop giving you consent, and then you start dropping the quality of position. So you can't really show no personalization in certain cases. Like, let's imagine I don't give consent to Netflix to use my cookies or something like that. They can't really drop it to zero. How can you have some backup plans? And that's again creates a load on your maintenance if you are sort of in that zone where you are heavily dependent on user permission to do personalization.
Yeah, I think on that point, I turned off my watch history on YouTube a few months ago just because I thought, well, I'll secure my data, I'll make it private. But then suddenly, I think a couple of months later, my homepage on the app just disappeared, all the content. There's nothing there. And
Yes.
I went to YouTube Shorts, no content at all. It said, if you want to view the homepage and view the Shorts page, I have to give permission to give my data to them, basically.
I think this actually, in my opinion, is product management miss, because you need to be aware of all these unintended consequences of your decision, and you're compromising user experience. There is still a lot of content that you can surface to the users, and you can do it in a very different way. So I think that's where, like, there is a level of it, right? Like, you need to be really obsessed with your users, and that's when it comes. That's when you sort of getting these angles that you never thought of, that comes into play.
Yeah, I think one of the discussions I had at YouTube just to decide to go to the extreme route and just show no content at all to people who were disabled that
Yeah, exactly.
permission is quite extreme.
Yeah. Yes, definitely it is.
Yeah, so I mean, I think based on everything we talked about, there's so much to think about. There's so much to factor in, and development cost, time cost to really implement a solid, robust system that you can scale over time well. It sounds like it's probably pricing out a lot of startups, smaller companies. It's unless it's pivotal to your I suppose, value proposition and the ultimate goals of what you're trying to achieve as a company, it's probably better potentially to go and buy an existing solution, integrate into your product, than start from scratch. Is that a fair point to say? And I suppose, in your opinion, what is the point at which you say, yes, we're going to build this out ourselves?
I think it's the same simple answer to that question is that how much of your business model depends on personalization. If you're a content organization, you can't really live without personalization. Like that is the core aspect of what you're doing. So you need to sort of figure that out. You need to build that. Frankly, you can't really not build that. But if you are a SaaS-based organization, a business SaaS-based organization, which or I don't know, let's take an extreme example, like you're a modular kitchen designer or something like that, then you can live with not having that level of personalization, because ultimately the people are buying service from you, which is a physical service, which is very different. So it depends upon your business model. But one thing I would say on that, other way to look at actually is that the people who are likely to use your product, especially in B2C world, are using some really state-of-the-art, highly well-tuned personalization recommendation algorithms. So you need to match that. User has that experience, that you need to come closer to that, or they are just not going to get impressed by what you're doing. So especially if you're, so in that particular case, what I would recommend is that try to use the open source algorithm if you can't afford the cost. There are so many good algorithms available on GitHub or Hugging Face or something like that, which you can just download and customize it to a certain extent, which would reduce your cost significantly. But ultimately, there are not many shortcuts here, frankly. If your business depends on it, you better build it, or else you'll be forever paying a huge amount of bill, and you won't control your destiny.
Awesome. Well, yeah, there's so much you kind of covered there, and a lot for people to digest. And if there was a few takeaways that you'd like to leave people with in terms of the things they should really think about in terms of translating all this knowledge into an actual product development piece, what would you recommend to people as key takeaways?
I think key takeaways would be, I think personalization is the really powerful mechanism through which you can drive some really strong user engagement. So the result of it are really rewarding, but equally the effort of it are equally high. So it's high effort, high reward kind of a system, I would say. So don't be shy to take all the efforts. Especially if your organization can deliver some unique value to users and to the business, it's really important to invest in it. And how do you invest it? Make sure your data is there. Make sure you understand your audience, and make sure you have very clear understanding of your goals. These three things are non-substitutable. And start small. I think that's really important. Start small. Keep experimenting. And keep adding to the system rather than try to aim for the best in class automation right out of the gate. You'll get there much faster if you start small rather than if you aim bigger and go for a waterfall style big thing to get out of the thing as the first thing to do. So really important to keep on experimenting and keep on modifying as you go.
Varun, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much for giving up your time to share your wealth of knowledge with everyone. And if people would like to come and connect with you, can they find you on LinkedIn? Where else can they find you?
LinkedIn is the best way to get in touch with me, and feel free to message me. I'm always there to respond to you.
Great. Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes as well to your profile. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Product Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to leave a follow on your preferred podcast platform and subscribe on YouTube. I'll see you in the next episode.